A lieutenant general of the U.S. military in Japan has publicly declared that the U.S. has set traps for Chinese troops in Japan, the Philippines and other regions. This, he believes, will allow the West to defeat China in the Pacific, repeating the trap the US and NATO set for Russian forces in Ukraine. Just how credible is the American general's claim? The rare setting the theater statement was made by Lieutenant Gen. James Biermann, commander of the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force and the top US Marine Corps commander in Japan. In a rare aggressive interview with the Financial Times, he discussed exactly how to fight the Chinese military. His interview may confirm that the US is prodding China into military action in a war it believes would be more beneficial to the West if it broke out. Biermann begins by taking credit for some of Ukraine's recent military successes in the conflict with the United States and NATO. He claimed that the United States and NATO, through long-term preparations, had created a battlefield for Russia in favor of Ukraine, and that this preparation and pre-setting of the battlefield had played a significant role. He went on to state that if the United States were to go to war with China, this experience would help the West presuppose a similar battlefield environment in the Pacific and would also work, allowing the United States to defeat Chinese forces in combat. He also said such preparations are firmly underway. Biermann suggested that the US military was setting carefully considered traps for the Chinese military in areas such as Japan and the Philippines. He also said bluntly that this was part of the Pentagon's strategy in Japan and elsewhere in Asia to prepare for a military conflict with China over Taiwan. Such an undisguised statement by a US military commander is rare in recent years when Sino-US relations have been deteriorating and shows that the US government and the US military are no longer hiding their intention to intervene militarily in China's reunification process. General Biermann asserted that after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the United States and NATO carefully prepared for a future conflict, training Ukrainians, prepositioning supplies, and identifying locations where the West could choose military operations. He said the United States is setting up such battlefields in Japan, the Philippines and other parts of Asia. It also shows that the US is setting a trap for the Chinese military by provoking the Chinese mainland to take military action against Taiwan. The report analyzed that the US military recently proposed the formation of a small force in the Asia-Pacific region, specializing in quick and covert operations in islands and straits in East Asia and the Western Pacific to counter China's anti-intervention strategy in the region. The Pentagon has long argued that China would win a war by using a large number of missiles, aircraft and ships to deter US and Western forces from intervening in the Taiwan zone. Biermann also noted that during the recent exercise, the U.S. Marine Corps established for the first time a bilateral ground tactical coordination center between the U.S. and Japan. U.S. forces no longer work parallel to a separate Japanese command center. Units of the Japanese military have been designated to operate with the American forces in Japan and no longer participate in training arrangements with the American forces. He also noted that similar preparations were underway in the Philippines, citing his government's consideration of allowing the United States to add 5 more bases where weapons and other supplies could be deployed to the 5 it already has. These, he argues, are leverage points for the U.S. military that can give it a head start in different operational plans. It must be acknowledged that the United States did make a large number of targeted deployments and actions in response to Russia's military actions in Ukraine, including providing Ukraine with critical, time-sensitive and accurate intelligence, continuing to provide Ukraine with far superior quality weapons and equipment, and persisting in training Ukrainian military personnel. This does give the Ukrainians some advantages, but Mr. Biermann overstates when he credits the US and NATO with much of the credit. It is not so much that the United States helped the Russians win some local battles, but that the Russian army was less effective than most had expected before the war, making it less capable of defeating the Russians as a whole. As the fighting continues, Russian forces still control parts of Ukraine. The biggest Ukrainian victory was the capture of Kherson, but one of the main reasons for this was the Russian withdrawal, so these gains could not yet be seen as a final victory for the Ukrainian side. Therefore, Biermann's comment on the US setting a trap is not completely consistent with the real situation. Therefore, there are certain loopholes in what he said about setting a trap for the Chinese military. It is generally believed that China's anti-access denial strategy refers to the Chinese mainland military's use of strategic weapons systems, such as missiles, aircraft carriers and submarines, to prevent the US military from interfering in specific sea and airspace. For example, China's large number of ballistic missiles and cruise missile weapons, as well as the newly commissioned hypersonic missiles and even the hypersonic orbital bombers under development, can effectively penetrate the current air and sea defense system of the U.S. military, sink U.S. aircraft carriers and other ships, and strike the main bases of the U.S. military in the first and second island chains. In this context, Biermann pointed out that increasing the number of bases in the Asia-Pacific and prepositioning supplies will not solve the enormous challenges that China's strategy poses to the U.S. military. U.S. bases in Japan and the Philippines are already within range of China's long-range missiles, making them difficult to defend against a barrage of incoming missiles. The addition of several bases and the pre-deployment of dispersed materials may reduce the density of Chinese missiles striking a single U.S. military facility, but the number of aircraft carriers, fighter jets and other platforms necessary for actual operations will not increase significantly, so there is no guarantee that the U.S. can avoid China's long-range strikes. This is the weak point of Biermann's statement. In fact, all this is the main reason why the U.S. military is strengthening the second island chain and even the Pacific Fleet facilities in Hawaii. The U.S. Pacific Command in Hawaii received $87.9 million to build the barracks, along with $103 million to upgrade missile storage facilities and $29 million to create an Army National Guard Readiness Center. It is not difficult to see that the real intention of the U.S. military is not different from the Asia-Pacific strategy confirmed by military analysts in the past. The U.S. military is adopting a retreat strategy in the Pacific Ocean, out of the range of most Chinese missiles, avoiding the spearhead of the Chinese military in wartime, and then trying to participate in the coastal battles in East Asia and Southeast Asia through mobile penetration. This is the opposite of what Biermann said. There are, of course, some obvious strategic initiatives of practical value on the U.S. side, such as the U.S. manipulated decision by the Japanese government to dramatically increase military spending, despite its sluggish economy, and the reluctance of its people to pay more taxes to help reduce the burden on the U.S. military in the Asia-Pacific. It is better than solely relying on the U.S. Asia-Pacific forces to support the war. All in all, Biermann's idea seems to make some sense on paper, but it is inconsistent with the actual operation of the U.S. military. We cannot rule out the possibility that it is actually a kind of strategic deception. Perhaps more importantly, Biermann's interview may well confirm the terrible truth that the United States is determined to maximize its own interests by forcing China into a national war. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, share and comment.